Today, my former MP Mark Prisk joins me. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. And it's finally good to have a good conversation with yourself, because obviously Hertford and Stortford is a pretty new constituency. But prior to you getting into politics, let's speak about your life before. So what was it like? Because I know you weren't born here.
No, that's right. So I was born in Cornwall, and this was back in 1962, so, a few thousand years ago. It was really very much around the period when the country was actually struggling economically. Cornwall was very poor. So to give you an example, my hometown in the 1970s, youth unemployment was north of 50%, 50. Adult unemployment was 23, 24, 25%. So, and when you live 100 miles west of Exeter and there's only one direction to go, which is east, it is a small environment to live in. But, that notwithstanding, perfectly happy child love. It wasn't sort of Charles Dickens kind of story at all. But yeah, so my interest in politics actually in some ways came through what was going on with the 3-day week and the fact that there were periods when I was 13, 14, when the lights would go out at about 7 because there was a big dispute between the trade unions, the mining unions principally, but also the electricity unions as they had at the time with the government of the day. So you kind of, politics hit you pretty, directly in that way. And I think I also became aware of it because, I'm going to say because of James Bond. But the reason for that is I was quite interested at sort of 11, 12, 13 in the Ian Fleming books. And they were very much around the Cold War, East versus West, the Soviet Union versus NATO. So if you're reading that kind of thriller, you're starting to be aware of what does East and West mean, and what is the Soviet Union, and what is the Warsaw Pact, and that was the shape of politics. So I guess I was very aware of politics in my teenage years. Got involved with the Cornish Young Conservatives, which was fun, and then at uni, at Reading University, where I did land management, I was chairman of the Reading University Conservative Association, went on to be a vice chairman of the Federation of Conservative Students nationally. Ran a campaign against CND in favor of multilateral disarmament and in favor of the NATO decisions to deploy cruise missiles in response to what the Soviet Union was doing on the Polish borders. So, in a funny way, a lot of that now sounds quite familiar, Russia being a really difficult neighbor, constantly causing problems with its immediate Western neighbors, disputes with strikes, problems with public finances. So yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's a long time ago, and yet it feels quite familiar now. So that got me up to uni. So, and I suppose what I would say is my parents said to me, okay, you're interested in politics, that's fine, but you might never make it. You might never get elected, or you might get elected for 5 years and be out. So you need a backup. And I decided to do land management to become a chartered surveyor. And that worked very well because it meant I had an alternative. I was always able to know that I could earn my living outside of politics. And I didn't feel going into politics when you're in your 20s, going to Parliament when you're 20s, was a good idea, because I just kind of felt what experience are you really bringing to the Palace of Westminster. But that was all the generality. And then would you like me just to briefly talk about the sort of parliamentary process?
Sure. Yeah, please do.
Okay. So I ran in what they call a no hope seat in the East End of London. So this was in what was then Newham Northwest. So if you think of the area in London, it's the area which includes where the Olympics were held, Stratford. But also the area of Forest Gate and so on. It was held by, it had always been held as an area ever since the days of Keir Hardie in the 19th century, when they started to form the Labour Party. The 19th century, 20th century. So they just around the end of the First World War. So it had always been a staunch Labour seat, but it was a great experience to do. And I would strongly say to people thinking about going into politics, go and do a seat where the other side is absolutely rock solid, because you'll learn a great deal. The volunteers will be small in number, but very committed. and you can make all your mistakes there, where you won't be under huge scrutiny, and it's a good way to learn the difference between being a volunteer and being the candidate. So I did that in the 92 election and really enjoyed it. Then I got selected for what was in theory a winnable seat, a safe, well, not a safe Tory seat, but a Tory seat with a good majority. It's between Bath and Bristol. It's called Wanstead, and it became the area that in the end Jacob Rees-Mogg became a member for, and before him Dan Norris. And in fact, Dan Norris beat me in the 97 election. And what had happened was I'd been selected in late 95. I did 18 months back and forth to that area, down there 3 days a week, at home 4 days a week, and trying to run my own business at the same time. But obviously the 1997 general election was when Labour had a major landslide. And so, although there was a notional majority of between 6,000 and 8,000, it went to Labour on the day. So very disappointing. But in a sense, the swing I had was lower than most of the seats. So I kind of felt that it's just one of those times when you stand that it's almost regardless of what you've done, the public mood is they want to go in a different direction, regardless of who's wearing a blue rosette or a red rosette. And we've seen this, in the last couple of elections, haven't we? That the public decides it's time for a change, and regardless of who the candidate is and what they do. So there I was. I'd had 2 cracks at Parliament, 1997. Clearly Labour in for a while. So went back, restarted the business. And I kind of took the view that if I stood again the following time, which ended up being 2001, I kind of felt that I shouldn't, that probably would be my last attempt. If I didn't get in then, that would be it. So fortunately, and I was living at the time in Bushy Heath, so west part of Hertfordshire. But I'd done a load of work with in a commercial agency business in the property world in Sawbridgeworth, Stortford, Harlow, some in Hertford, and so I knew this area quite well. And so when Burn Wells, who was the then MP, announced he was going, I thought, well, this is as good a place for me anyway. And it's a funny thing, because when I walked into the first interview for the first interview on the first occasion, I just felt at home. I can't describe why, but I did, and it clicked. And so thankfully the electorate, the local party, decided to choose me. I think there were 180 people applied, and we went from 12 on the long list, 6 on the short list, 3 on the last round. And it was perfect, absolutely perfect. I felt at home. I think they must have felt at home with me, and that was the beginning of 18 years in Westminster.
Well, I know a lot of parties do it a bit differently to the Conservatives. So you can potentially be an MP, so you sign yourself up to a list, right? And then they can select you to be anywhere in the country.
Yeah. So what they try to do is, and it's difficult in terms of being how what is the quality you're looking for? Is it just the fact that they're local? I think having an affinity with an area is good, but I think it's also important that you bring other qualities. And I went for different selections, and I think the parties now are less willing to choose somebody who has no connection, so they almost speed it themselves. But yeah, what the system is that you apply to the National Party. They will then check on you, because particularly these days, as dare I say, reform has increasingly found out, if you don't do your checks, you will discover that actually you wish you had. So the National Party will do all of that process, but it'll also, it's big enough to be able to do the sort of training and support. And that's quite important, because the range of different things you need to do, whilst you may bring, let's say, tremendous experience of being an ex-serviceman, or being somebody who's a teacher, or somebody who's an experienced business person, some of the political skills, you may have some of them, but you won't have them all. So the idea is you do the training at the national level, and so you're on an approved list. And then what happens after that and this varies slightly election to election, but certainly the system I went through was one where the association then tells the National Party, well, we're looking for a candidate. They will offer them, they will then put that vacancy out to the list. It's up to you as an individual to apply. I think what they're doing now is filtering that slightly and creating more regional lists so that people in Exeter aren't going to apply for Norwich or vice versa. Though I have to say, I would have thought it was self-evident that just in the selection process, from the individual's point of view, they're not going to want to do that necessarily, and what is local in London? It's I mean, how many people can honestly claim to be local in like very few. So I think it's a difficult balancing act. And usually the association makes that choice, and certainly the ones I've been through, and I sat in at the back for the selection for my successor, for Julie Marson. So I think the local associations are usually able to do that filtering for them.
Well, you mentioned reform there, and a lot of people up and down the country are starting to look towards reform as the last option, or the Green Party. But let's just keep it for reform for now. And obviously, with social media, that's another reason why reform are doing so well. But what differentiates the two? Why would you say vote Conservative rather than vote Reform, who are looking to some people as a very big option?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. I think the first thing is, if you want an organisation to be a good government, then they need to have lots of different people and talents. And I think the fundamental problem for Reform is that they are essentially really one person. And Nigel Farage, who is very charismatic, it's interesting, this is his fourth or fifth political party. And my impression from all I've seen of him, and I never have met him, so I can only go by the people who have and by what I've seen, he strikes me as being a natural loner. He's happy, I think if we had an American presidential system and we were voting for an individual, I could understand the logic more of saying, well, we've tried the other folk and they don't work, so let's give this guy a run. But you're actually electing a government, and that's a different ballgame. And the tension there is twofold. One, if he tries, it's very noticeable, the people who've come in who are capable, they're in for a while and then they clash with him, and they end up leaving. And that says to me that he's not a team builder. And goodness knows, you only have to look at this government and indeed past governments to think to yourself, you really do need to be a good team leader. And you look at the successful governments, and I would, I'll pick a Labour example, actually. So I would say that immediately after the Second World War, the country decided they didn't want Churchill. They wanted a Labour government under Clement Attlee. Quiet man, quite unremarkable in many ways. But he had a cabinet of serious players, each of whom were able to drive in their area the changes needed. And you need that. You cannot do it all from number 10. And as we're seeing with the current government, there are problems. So I think that my first thing I would say about Reform is I know people have been frustrated with the Tory party in the past and with Labour now, but I just don't think that unless Farage changes completely and says, actually, I'm going to be a team leader and I'm very happy for these people to lead in this area, and he shows that he can do that, I think you're just voting for chaos from day one. Literally, if you think it's been bad with the current lot, you wait till people say it can't be any worse. It can be a hell of a lot worse, in that sense. So that would be the first thing. I think the second thing in policy terms is that it seems to me that Farage, that he's got one critical issue that he's very strong on, which is obviously to deal with immigration. But beyond that, I'm trying to look at how he's going to solve some of the financial problems. Because if you want better healthcare or you want lower taxes, in the end, there's a financial issue there. And I don't see that he's going to tackle what I see as the underlying issues. And what I think Kemi has been good at in the last 6 months is starting to turn the picture around to saying, well, hang on a moment, how can we afford these things? Where's the money coming from? How are we going to reduce the enormous amount of waste and so on going on within Westminster? And how can we make sure we balance the books? Because the truth is, this country's been living on other people's money for a very long time. And actually, it'll be your generation, Jamie. I mean, people say, oh, well, they can borrow more. But when governments borrow, all they're doing is they're creating an additional tax burden for your generation in the future. Because borrowing is just delayed tax. That's all it is. So, my generation, I personally think there's a big challenge to go on. And this is, for me, one of the areas where Farage won't address. We're going to have to say some difficult things to the public. We can't go on paying the level in terms of pension, particularly the triple lock. It's completely unsustainable. And you can't go on at the other end, in which nearly half the population are receiving benefits, because the other half just aren't enough people to pay for those benefits. So we've got to shift away from people being dependent on the state purse, because the state purse is basically taxpayers. The state has no money. And my frustration a bit with, I would love in some ways for reform to be quite radical about its financing, about the financing of how government should work, and to say the tough things. That would appeal, I think. But I just think at the moment all they want to do is to pander to whatever the latest moan is, and that is not a recipe for good government. So for me, that's the issue. It's less. I mean, of course, there are bigots and racists in reform. I suspect there are one or two in every political party. Reform seems to attract a lot more than everybody else. But equally, the truth is the immigration system is struggling. It's not doing its job properly. Governments have ducked the issue because there are very difficult issues around it, and it's complicated. And I'm just not sure. To me, I guess the way I would describe a reform is they're like that person who's very good at always telling you what's going wrong. And when you say, well, what would you do? Well, they've got no answer. They know what's wrong. They can say it. They can talk about it ad nauseam, but they aren't going to say what they're going to do. And you start poking them saying, well, okay, fine. You want to be in government. Great. What would you do? And they say, well, I wouldn't have started now. And you think, well, no, hang on a moment. Let's get some common sense in here. So that I suppose those are, I'm putting in very basic terms, but I just don't think, I think reform at the moment are a very loud protest, but not a lot more than that.
Well, I think the Greens you could put into that category as well. I think the Greens would be even more dangerous than reform. But in a place like Hertford and Stortford, local to us, the Greens are pretty attractive on a really local level with council and things like that. So what would your perspective be on the Green Party? Because I know that they're attracting a lot of attention as well.
Yeah. Well, again, similarly, I think as for those people who, I mean, I saw the Greens grow in Hertford and particularly, but where as well. It's born of a number of things. One, partly because a lot of people who used to live in London during COVID have come out of London, and particularly young people who can't afford to live in London have moved north and come into the Hertford and Ware area. I think secondly, there's always a natural, both those towns always had a strong left of centre core in them. Certainly when I arrived, Hertford Town Council was 12 members, 10 of whom were Labour, 2 of whom were Tory. So, and there was a strong old school socialist element within the community that was there. Remember, Shirley Williams was their Member of Parliament at one stage. So it's not new in that sense. I think what the Greens did locally very wisely was they focused on certain wards when they started, and they kept it very local. And they were able to do that thing, because actually strange enough, there's a number of people who I would see as natural Tories who are strong on long-term stewardship of their environment, who care about, whether it's climate change or waste and so on. And particularly the burden of development and the impact on roads and pollution and so on and so forth. And they're not necessarily left of centre in their politics. They're actually more communitarian. And, I used to be able to get a very strong group of votes out of Benjo because, I made sure, and it would be what I would do anyways, I would be on the ground, I'd be present, I led the way to stop the Greenbelt development proposals. I made sure that where the water company wasn't doing its job properly, I was right on top of the issue. And so that sense that actually this guy is for our community was quite strong. I could see they were building in numbers because there were an increasing number of different environmental concerns in the area. But I would say what has happened is that funny alliance within the Greens between the sort of local, middle of the road person who's naturally concerned about sort of the local environment, and then the hard left, for whom it's an ideological thing. And obviously their new leader nationally is very much of that bent, and believes that nationalising everything is the answer. And I think for a lot of young people, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, I think a lot of young people look at where they've got to in the last 10 or 15 years. The chances of owning their own home feel very slim. Earnings are difficult because we've not seen productivity, and therefore earnings and incomes grow as we should have done. The burden of student debt and the sense that somehow mainstream politics isn't working for them, and the clarity of the Green Party doesn't mean they're right. It's just that they're very clear because they're very, in my view, very simplistic about what they're saying, is quite attractive. And I think a lot of people will look at it and think, well, do you know what? I'm not sure I liked the Tories when they were in government. I certainly don't like Labour in government. And for those people who were Labour voters in 2024, a number of them have been really unhappy with Starmer's performance. And so they're looking around, and you've got Polanski, who's very, charismatic and all the rest of it. And they're thinking, I quite like what he says. Now, I think what always happens usually when we get to a general election and people start thinking about, will this party run the government any better? Will I be financially better or worse off? What will it mean for my family? They start to change. The votes start to move around a bit because, it's a very different thing to say is which political party do you like? And most people don't follow politics closely. So what will happen is whatever they last noticed on YouTube or whatever will probably be the thing they pick up on.
It's true, yeah.
And that's fair enough. That whether not everybody is a political anorak like me, and so that way. But then suddenly, when we're talking about a general election and we're talking about who do you want to run the country for the next 5 years, things start to shift. And also you'll see tactical voting. I think you'll see a lot of tactical voting against Farage. We are at a very interesting stage. But I think the way to, from a Conservative point of view, to tackle the Greens is to highlight the differences, particularly on the local party where they've made, they've had to suspend some of their more left-wing members from the district council, but then those individuals stay as a Green councillor at a town council, but not at a district. It's all a bit shifty. It's all a bit dodgy, and they get away with it because most people don't follow these things closely. I think there's going to be a big split there.
You mentioned you were part of the NATO association. I just wanted to speak about that when you were younger and what it means for you now.
Yeah.
Both sides of it. So Reform haven't been too keen on sort of supporting NATO, more like what Trump's doing. And if you look at Polanski and the Greens, they're not very keen on us even having nuclear weapons. So that to me sounds ludicrous, and I'm sure you'd probably agree.
Yeah, I think, and it's funny, isn't it? I'm thinking about back to the 70s where the Soviets had deployed tactical missiles very close to the Polish border. And they occupied Poland, they occupied Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and so on. So we could see what the challenge was. Today, it's a little less clear because they're not the Soviet Union anymore. But for me, NATO is about a group of friends working together so that the small nations don't get bullied by their immediate neighbor. And I think that's a really important principle. That's what Article 5 is about, which says basically that if you attack, let's say, for example, if Russia were to attack a member of NATO that's just one of the small members, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Poland, which is not that small, but then we would regard that as an attack on all of us. And that has proved to be really good. And it comes back to the notion of deterrence, which is that in order to deter the aggressor, the bully boy, the dictator, they have to know that the consequences of what they do would be so disastrous that they're just not even going to do it. And that was always the principle. And that's what nuclear deterrence essentially is about, because the West would struggle to hold the Soviet Union without the huge loss of soldiers' lives and the prospect of it going on for years and years. And therefore, the feeling was that if the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, then we in NATO needed to be able to match that. I think it's essential. I think particularly at the moment, anybody suggesting that Putin is not a threat, go to Salisbury, go and talk to the people there who for several weeks didn't know whether they were going to be poisoned because the Soviet Union, getting my slipping now, but Putin's guys had thought it was perfectly fine. They could get away with coming to our country and using a very dangerous, something that's actually outlawed, it is an illegal substance, in order to kill people who had dissatisfied Putin. And you think, well, if they're willing to do that, what else are they willing to do? I mean, I was trade envoy to the Scandinavian countries for a period. Go and talk to the Swedes, very mild-mannered, many, certainly not politically aligned from my point of view, but they will tell you, and one of the reasons they've now joined NATO after all these years of independence is because Putin, every day, every week, is driving interventions into their airspace by military aircraft, putting their ships, in some cases submarines, into Swedish waters, completely interfering with their cyberspace, and is constantly testing. What he's doing, he's poking and prodding to see just how willing we are to defend ourselves. And this goes on and on. And so I personally think Trump's approach to this is completely wrong. And this would again be, I think, internationally, one of the big divides between the Conservatives and Reform. I worry about Farage's links with Trump. I worry about his unwillingness, rather like Jeremy Corbyn, to criticize Putin. For me, the first job of the government is to keep us safe. And it's a dangerous world. And therefore, I want to make sure, and I'm not sure where we should be, but I want to make sure that we have the defenses in place, both militarily, but also in terms of infrastructure, and the ability to respond and to make it clear to Putin and others that if they wish to attack us, the consequences will be immeasurable for them. And that is the only way you deter violence. Bullies will always push you if they think you're soft. They will always try it on. And we don't want them to try it on, because trying it on means, war. And that's not where we want to be. So the lesson of history is always that if you want to stop war, you have to deter it by showing that you will defend yourself and you will make sure that the other side pays a price they're not prepared to pay. That is the only way you stop that kind of violence. So, that would be another area where I would have a huge problem, for example, with the Reform Party, let alone, obviously, our dear friend, Mr. Corbyn and his party, that remains unnamed as far as I can work out.
And it's not been too much of a success on their end.
It's glorious. It's straight out of Monty Python, your party. The whole People's Front of Judea. It's just glorious.
Yes, it's a gift that keeps on giving. But in terms of Russia and the war in the east of Europe, it's been a really, really intense one. And countries such as Romania and Poland have faced drones into their country, which could have sparked World War III. And it's also led to like a rampage of European countries stepping up with helping Ukraine. But for me, going back to what you said about Trump, what do you think the best idea is for this? Because I think that Ukraine should not be giving up any land, and certainly not be capping their military of under 1 million.
Well, I'd like to feel they shouldn't have to. I suspect they're going to have to give something. I think the argument probably would be around Crimea.
Which Russia have
but
had since 2014, though.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And you can argue there's a stronger history around the Crimea than there is, say, for the Donbass. I think there is a principle here, isn't there? If you say to an aggressor, so you've invaded this country, you claim it's yours, we're going to let you have the rewards for that as long as you stop fighting. Then what lesson do they draw from that? The lesson they draw from that is that if they use violence to go and seize land, the chances are they'll be rewarded for it. And that's the worst message you could possibly send to any person, who behaves as I mean, Putin does. I mean, he is a mafioso kind of leader. He kills people if they get in his way. And he thinks it's funny. You can see the way he behaves because he's an ex, FSB man. He's an ex-spy chief. And so people, in inverted commas, fall off windowsills and staircases and all the rest of it. And that's that is the man we're dealing with. And Trump, I don't know what it is about Trump. Trump, I think, I think he's quite an insecure man. I think his problem is he has this thing about you're a winner or you're a loser. And what he sees in Putin is someone who has held on to power for a very long time. And so regardless of any sense of morality, he sees that as a strength in the individual. He hates being in groups where he has to collaborate. It's why he hates going to the G7 or G20 or anything else. For him, it's all got to be about him. He's got all politicians have an ego, let's be honest. But for Trump, it is just extraordinary. So the difficulty for a British Prime Minister, whoever's in politics, is if he's the President of the United States and he's been duly elected, which he has, then you have to find a way to work with him. I always remember going slightly back to a James Bond film. There's a quote where there's an awkward moment and they're dealing with some dodgy people in the CIA. And the guy steps away from Bond and just says something like, that's nice. So let's just deal with the nice people in the world. And, what he's saying, obviously sarcastically, is the truth is very often as a political leader, no matter what you may think of other political leaders, you have to try and find a way to work with them. And if I would give Starmer one big credit, I would say that he clearly gave a lot of thought to how to find a working relationship with Trump and has worked at that. And that is to his credit. Because it's very difficult because people, before you get into government, and this is the difference between being a political protest group and being in government. In government, you've got to solve the problem. You can't just say, oh, well, I'm sorry, but I really don't like President Macron, therefore I'm not going to talk to the French. You've been asked to be the leader of the country. Your job is to work with these people. You may find them the most loathsome people on earth, but you've got to find some sort of way to work with your democratically elected colleagues. And, my frustration with Trump, I think, is that he clearly wants the Nobel Peace Prize. And therefore, all his foreign action is revolving around two things. One, how can he say that he's, what has he achieved in terms of creating peace, in inverted commas? And two, there does seem to be a family operation going on that links financial reward with America's power. And that is also quite concerning. If you look at the way in which... for example, the owner of Dell Computers this week has given $6 billion for a scheme that Trump is running. But it was clearly made, said to him that otherwise Dell might actually find its business being taxed or tariffed in a different way. And the use of tariffs has been clever, but I think destructive for Trump. So I think, my worry I personally feel very strongly that NATO is a very good alliance. It has had its problems, and we in Europe should own up and say that we have been living off the Americans for too long. So in that context, Trump is absolutely right. But what he shouldn't be doing is sending signals, which I think Putin is seeing very clearly, which is that America will stand by. It won't get involved, in which case Putin feels empowered, feels that he can get away with it, and look at his behavior, and that's very worrying, because if Ukraine fails and gets a crappy deal, which is forced into, who's next? Poland, Latvia, Lithuania? It'll probably be one of those. They'll go for one of the small ones. And
Moldova.
Could do, yes. I think more likely to be up in the Baltic, simply because the excuse will be, if you look at the map, you have Russia, then you have the former small states of Latvia, Lithuania, which were part of the Soviet Union, and there's a little tiny chunk of Russia to the left. And what I think he'll do, which is what the Soviets always used to do, is something will be concocted. There'll be a disturbance in one of the cities where they still have a third of the population speak Russian, and there'll be an accusation that the Russian-speaking people are being treated unfairly, and Putin will issue a statement saying this is not right, and I will not stand by if I think. And then there'll be a nasty police incident in which some Russian-speaking people will be killed, and so the Russians will then say, well, now we've got to send in support to defend our people, and with the police cars from Russia will come some tanks, and then there will be, and before you know where you are, you suddenly got a Russian occupation. That's the risk with it, and the tricky thing then for a Western leader is, at what point do you say, right, actually you've crossed the line and we're now at war with Russia? That's the tricky one.
As part of this proposal made by Russia and America, there was an election for Ukraine within 100 days. Now, I don't know what your opinion on that was, but couldn't there be a situation where Russia interfere with yet another election throughout Zelensky? What happens to Zelensky? But then what happens to Ukraine economically, but then also militarily as well?
Exactly. I think you've got to be very careful. I mean, I've no doubt that, like any country, there will be corruption in different parts of anything. So, that will be there. But you have to focus on the big picture. And I agree with you that I think there's a risk that if you make an election within the reaches of Russia, a condition, they will interfere, they will meddle, they will try and send out black propaganda, and before we know where we are, there's a shift. So, and the danger then is you could see it then fall into civil war, and then of course Putin would say, well, now I've got to step in because I've got to sort of tackle that. So you can see how these things could occur. That's the problem.
And with Trump, there is potential for him to run again after his stay in the White House. Do you believe that that's a chance, that if Trump is still well and kicking as he claims to be, he could be running again?
Well, he'd have to twist the Constitution, and he'd have to get both houses of Congress to do that. Obviously, Roosevelt was able to stand, but that was when they were at war, and there was a very, very clear consensus that he was by far the best person for it. I suspect that, and in American terms, are only 4 years. So when we get to year 2.5, the clock starts ticking, and because of their unbelievably long election periods and primaries and all that stuff, I suspect we'll see Trump Jr. versus Vance running for the Republican ticket. I think that'll how it'll be, because I think the Donald will quite enjoy the idea of being kingmaker, and he'll play that game for as long as he can. But it depends. His health may go, so we can but hope. But equally, I mean, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I couldn't vote Republican now, and I certainly wouldn't vote Democrat now. If you'd asked me 4 or 5 years ago, if Mike Bloomberg was standing, I would have gone independent in America, because I was a Reagan, kind of guy. I thought Ronald Reagan, not the brightest academically, sure, but he understood the role of the office of the president. He knew what he did was he appointed very, very capable people around him. And he understood that, and anybody who's watched West Wing will know this, but the job of the president is to listen to the expert advice, to have different voices in the room, and then to make a decision. That's your job. You chair that advice. And the secret is to make sure that you've got the right blend of different voices in the room, which will very often be in conflict with each other. So that, because I always used to find this as a minister, you find this at political level, the truth of the situation usually emerges when you're getting different opinions and you're able to listen to from different perspectives. And then you can see that actually on balance A is right, or on balance actually I'm going to go with B, but I'm going to condition it because of what I've heard from A, and I think this is where we're going to go. But your job at the end of the day is to make decisions, and you've got to keep that. And one of the stunning things I find with this government is the pace of their inability to make decisions. It's just, I mean, as a business minister, so I, in 2010, became the business and enterprise minister. So my areas of responsibility were oversight of all the main business sectors, and there are about 15 or 20 different key business councils with all the different bodies there, making sure that we drove the deregulation agenda across the whole of Whitehall. I was asked to take on the trade portfolio for the first 6 months until they appointed the new guy. So I needed to travel China, the Middle East, and so on. Then I held the small business portfolio, and I had the job of winding down the regional development agencies and creating local enterprise partnerships. So quite a big brief. I mean, essentially what was the old Department of Trade and Industry in its entirety. And the critical thing is that you as minister are at the top of this process of decisions that need to be taken. And very often some of them are small decisions and some of them are consequential. What are we doing about electric vehicles? Are we making sure that the congestion charge, the way in which the charging system is going to operate, that infrastructure for EVs? Which technologies are we choosing? Which manufacturers are you going to work with? And that's just one topic, And what you've got to be able to do is to think through where you want to be, and then drive the service machine. So I would work through, a box of papers every day, in addition to all the meetings, and then 2, if not 3 boxes, Thursday or Friday, for the weekend. And you've got to keep that machine going. And I know that in this government, there are some ministers who take a box a week. I took one every single day. And when I say a box, it's usually this deep. So for the listeners, as it were, it's a good 6 to 8 inches deep of papers where they need your decision in order to make the announcements, in order to do the things, in order to write the legislation, etc., etc., etc. So, you've got to drive that machine, and that decision making is critical to being good government. Anyway, I've drifted a very long way from the subject, but there we go.
Well, I've got a few more points that I wanted to mention.
Yeah,
Knife
sure.
crime being one of them. And I know a lot of people, especially around London, and especially women as well, are so scared to be sexually assaulted or to be at the brunt end of a knife attack. Yeah. How much power do MPs actually have to control knife attacks? Because I think a lot of people are of the idea that perhaps the sentences should be quite a bit more than what they are.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things to this. There's sentencing, but there's also enforcement. I get frustrated with people who say, well, we must change the law to do this. I say, great, okay, so how are you going to enforce it? It's like 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. They're useless unless there's a policeman, unless there's a traffic cop, and we don't have traffic cops because for various reasons. So in terms of crime, I think there are parts of London where things have got a lot worse. I despair of the mayor in London, Sadiq Khan. I thought when he was elected that as a moderate and as a Muslim, he would be a great example, perhaps, for the city. But sadly, he's hopeless at making decisions. He just wants to pose. And whereas Andy Burnham, who I knew when he was at Westminster, Andy Burnham in Manchester cracks on and makes decisions. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with all of them, but at least he understands the job of being there. And my frustration with Khan in London is that young men, very often sadly young black men, are stabbing other young black men on a regular basis in their teens. And he seems as if it's nothing to do with him. He is responsible for the Metropolitan Police Force. He is the mayor of London. He should take it very personally. and he should be driving that, but he's very hands off. And I which I despair of, because you look, and I met several families who've been through this situation where the teenage son has been stabbed by another teenager. A lot of it is driven around county lines and drugs issues, but not all. But that's the system which is also bringing the knives into circulation, creating the gang culture. I think there's another deeper issue here as well, I'm afraid, which is a lot of those lads in the teenage years who are going around with knives. For them, the only positive male role model is not their father or an adult in their family. It is it's the other older lads, so they want to fit into those gangs. And so it becomes incredibly difficult on some estates to grow up as a teenage boy without being drawn into all of that. So I think what I would say is, yes, I agree with you about that sentences should be robust, but I also think it's about enforcement. And I think it's about being honest about whether or not families know where their kids are, and that there are strong male role models who are giving those lads the model of what it is to grow up as a boy and then as a man. And I don't see enough of that. Because you've got to understand what the drivers of these actions are, as well as the enforcement. It's a bit like the poor shopkeepers who are having to deal with the whole sort of thing of shoplifting now. It's theft, and people who are frankly middle class and think it's perfectly acceptable to stick a bottle of gin in their bag. I'm sorry, I'd tax them their pants off. Or charge them, whatever, because it's theft, and it frustrates me enormously. No shop worker or no shop owner should have to put up with the kind of nonsense they're dealing with. So on that kind of thing, I'm old school. There are clear rules. The government has to make sure the rules are sensible, but they need to be robustly enforced. You break those rules, particularly if it involves violence, you will pay the penalty.
But there's people up and down the country and in London as well, especially in certain areas, where I suppose their counter to that would be, we don't have the money to simply be able to afford bread or food or a baby formula and things like that, which is, I suppose, why the Labour government have abolished the two-child benefit cap, which I don't personally agree that's the right thing to do. But what do you think? How would you counter that if people can't afford stuff and they're stealing because of it?
Well, I was brought up in a town in West Cornwall where unemployment was 50% of young people and 20%, as I said earlier, of adults. I think it's an insult, frankly, to a lot of people who are struggling to assume that, well, if you're, it's perfectly acceptable and it's what poor people do. It is not what poor people do. They have the same standards. And so this kind of, oh, well, it's not my fault. No, it's your fault. And we need to make it clear. Now, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be sensitive to the fact that if kids are being brought up in temporary accommodation because we aren't building enough homes, that isn't having a detrimental impact on them. Of course it is. But there is no excuse. And once you start saying, oh, well, it's okay because it's all right because of this, no, that is not acceptable. By all means, we should look at the food bank side. By all means, we need to look at incomes that parents are getting in. By all means. But moving on to the two-child cap thing, there's a bit of me that thinks that maybe, given we need actually more, we're seeing a drop away in the number of children in this country, that maybe there's an argument for moving the cap up to 3 children. I'd want to look at the numbers, but I agree with you in principle, and I thought Kemi Badenoch got this spot on when she said that you don't lift children out of poverty by making the whole country poorer. And what she's trying to say there is that it's all very well, but if some families now can have 5, 6, 7 children and be substantially better off as a result than otherwise, who's paying for that? Well, the rest of us are. And those people who have perhaps chosen to be more careful, who've chosen to only have 2 children because that's all they can afford, are then watching somebody down the street who's on number 5 or 6, and they're taking the money in from the other taxpayers. So there's that issue of fairness. I think it's just reminding people that benefits are other people paying them their taxes, and we're running out of people who are paying more taxes than are receiving benefits. That's the scary bit. And at some point, and I saw it in the 70s because the Labour government then ran out of money, the International Monetary Fund had to step in, go to the Treasury, and they made the decisions as to what the government spent on, because otherwise the government was going to go bust. And then there is no money. There's no money to pay any doctor or nurse or whatever. So it's, we all know this with debt, don't we? It's sooner or later, if you don't get a grip of it, then it gets a grip of you. And then it's all out of control. I used to see this as a constituency member. Some people got caught in this sort of credit card trap, and it's never a good thing.
I remember a few years ago, probably when I was about 11 or 12, I saw, well, more than a few, but I saw a video of This Morning, and it was a mother with, I think it was something about 6, 7, 8 children she had. And she said the system will keep allowing her to do it, so she'll keep having children because she's getting money out of it, right? And it was an insult to me back then, but I suppose to people who are paying taxes, and obviously I wasn't paying taxes at 12 years old, it's so much more of an insult. Another thing that people could consider quite the insult is immigration, and specifically illegal immigration, of people taking that risk across the channel and entering our country. I can probably imagine, but what would your thoughts be on that? And a Reform and the Conservatives, they're pretty similar, but there's also differences in between the two as well.
Yeah, I think it's complex, therefore there's no one answer. And if somebody says to me, oh, all we've got to do is A, then they don't understand the question, I think would be my view. So there's lots of elements to this. I think you have to think about why are people coming here and not just staying in France or Germany. I think driving that is partly that we have a very open labour market, therefore they can get work in the black market or indeed in the legal labour market very easily. So that is driving them to feeling that if they come here, they'll be better off than they would if they were in France or Germany. So I'm talking here about the illegal people who are coming on the boats and so on. So I think we've got to be honest about that, and we've got to decide what we do about that. I think we do need to have some overseas workers, but we need to think about in which areas we want them. And for those areas where we struggle to employ people, any farmer will tell you, or anybody in the farming world will tell you, it's actually quite difficult to get the indigenous population to play ball. So we have to be honest with ourselves about that. But I think what's needed there is a clear, as they do in Australia, they have a system of controls and quotas around the numbers of people coming in. So one, you've got to have strict numbers. Two, you've got to enforce it. I think a lot of what they've done in America is too brutal, but actually one of the things that Trump has been able to do is, because it's seen on television that, people who are working illegally in restaurant kitchens and whatever are being arrested and deported, the message is going home that actually this it's not worth trying to get across the Mexican border. And so what they've seen is that an enormous number of people from Latin America just aren't making the journey anymore. So I think you've got to start with that end of it. You've got to be, quite tough with that. That may involve either reforming or getting out of the EHCR. But I think you do that once you've worked out what the thing is that's driving people to come here as opposed to France and Germany. Then I think actually the Tory policy now on chasing the money, the gangs that are feeding off this, you do need to follow the money with those people. It's like human trafficking, which I dealt with when I was in government, and it's all about money. It's all about criminal activity. And so what you've got to do is to track the money, and you've got to take it off them. You've got to make it not worth their while, not just in prison, or the possibility of imprisonment, because some of these guys, they're on squillions and they're seven layers behind somebody else. So getting to them is very difficult. So I think there's all of that is important. I do think it's important, however, that we should focus on those issues and not start trying to divide one another on colour, creed, race, or whatever. I think that's a huge mistake. Not least, we started this conversation with, here's somebody from Cornwall who's now settled in Hertfordshire. What does he know about the local area? Once you start getting into the, who are you? And we don't like him because he's tall or he's short or it's a woman who's, or a black person or whatever, all of those things. I strongly believe that one of our great things about this country was our willingness to take in people who are in desperate need. but we can't take everybody. And we need to look at what's driving them coming here, especially. This is the illegal side. I haven't talked about the legal side, but just the illegal side. We need to understand why they're coming, and then we need to close those opportunities. We need to communicate to them. We need to enforce it, and then we need to really get on top of the criminal gangs. And I think that is the right way forward. And then you'll start to see those numbers drift away. And then, there's a lot of other issues then about the way in which a lot of public authorities favorably treat some groups over others. And that stirs the pot as well.
I'm conscious of how much we have for time, Mark, but
yeah, sure.
Was the Rwanda plan a good or bad plan?
I think the idea was good. I'm not sure Rwanda was the right place. I always felt that the Balkans, Romania, somewhere like that, made more logical sense. And the Italian government went that way, and actually they've been quite successful.
Well, Romania is a great country. Have you ever been?
I haven't, no. And I always very tempted to go to Transylvania, as Gary Oldman describes it in the film Dracula. But I haven't, and it's one of those countries I really do want to go to.
It's one of my favourite countries, so you should definitely go. Obviously, Hertford and Stortford is now Labour. Josh Dean is the man who is our MP. What have you made of his time so far? He's obviously one of the younger MPs in Parliament, and as far as I'm aware, I've seen him a few times out and about.
Yes.
What's your thoughts on him?
Well, he is very young, and I actually think it doesn't do anybody a favours getting into Parliament that young, because you need a foundation personally in your life to do it, because it's very intense, it's very personal and so on. So I hope it doesn't damage him on a personal level. He seems personable. I've not met him. He's been wise enough to make sure that he appears in both Hertford and Stortford, because if you do too much in one and not the other, there's no middle to this constituency. That's the odd thing about it. So you've got to make sure that each of the communities feels that you're their MP. I think the problem he's come up against is he's come in with a new government coming in. He's naturally therefore defended everything they've done, and he's now starting to find, I suspect, the groups who were perhaps open and sympathetic towards him are now expecting him to stand up for them, and he's remaining quite silent in that sense. It's not easy. I've been there. I've had to defend all sorts of some of the sillier things that we've ended up doing for whatever reason, so I know what it feels like. But at some stage, he's going to need to decide what he actually wants to be known for, and just being local, frankly, isn't enough.
Is he going to be struggling in the next election? I think there's a possibility he'll run again.
Well, I suspect he'll run again. I will be surprised if he didn't. It's a difficult thing to judge at the moment. My instinct is that this is a constituency that has, with a small c, conservative instincts. But what the local party's got to do, and they very kindly asked me to be the honorary president. So what we've got to do is to be out, visible, engaged, and all the things that a lot of our councillors have done over the years, and be seen. And so as and when the local party chooses a new person, then that person is going to have to get out there and start from scratch and not assume. One of the things you have to remember, that when I started in 2001, Hertford was solidly Labour, Ware was mostly Labour, and Sawbridgeworth was pretty mixed, mostly Liberal Democrat. And so what you've got to do is you've got to get out there and pound the streets. You've got to have a clear message. If you say you're going to do something, you've got to do it. You've got to exceed expectations. And so people start to feel that actually this guy, we know him. He said he was, yes, they did that. And they start to regain that confidence. I think they will. They're a great local association. There's some very capable people, and hopefully we'll be able to turn the constituency blue in a couple of years' time.
And one of the last things I wanted to ask is, once you leave as an MP, and I know for you it was a tiny bit different. So let's say someone like Josh gets ousted at the next election.
Yes.
What happens to him? I was told that he gets a year's salary and then he goes.
My understanding, well, I got 6 months, so
Okay.
I was there for 18 years, and I got 6 months pay. So I'm not moaning about it, but I think they could do slightly more than that. If it's
Hmm.
a year now, I thought it was 9 months that they got, but if it's a year, that's fine. The tricky thing for him, and this is difficult, I work as an executive coach, and I agreed to help some of the Tory MPs who had lost in 2024. And the truth is that when you leave politics, what can you say that you've actually, what actual transferable skills, that would operate in the business world, for example, can you say that you can bring to a new employer? And it's quite a difficult thing to say because it's an unusual nature of skills, isn't it, as an MP? So, yeah, it's a tough time. I suspect a large number of Labour MPs are going to be doing what a large number of Tory MPs did a year ago or 18 months ago, which is to suddenly discover that actually the public's not that thrilled about employing an ex-MP. There's a phrase, if you're there's nothing more ex than an ex-MP.
That's a bold thing to say. I'm so sorry. I've got so many questions to ask,
That's
Mark.
all
So
right. No, I gave very long answers. My apologies.
no worries. When an MP builds their team up, so I know, for example, they'll have a media man and some other people. Who did you have in your team? What were their roles? And is it a case of like you're a bit of a celebrity and they just fill out your calendar for you?
Do you mean as a candidate or as the actual MP?
As the actual MP.
So as the MP, you get a small budget for staffing, and that's really about making sure that you can communicate with and work with the constituents. So that's not a party thing. Now, most of that is dealing with the correspondence and the local organisations that want to see you and meet you and so on. And it's up to you. There are no rules. You have to work out how to do this. And in the first year, most MPs, I think wisely, usually try and say yes to pretty much everything, because you've got to work your way around and get a sense of what those activities are and so on. Then in the second year, you can start to be a little more selective because you can't get to everything all the time. There aren't enough days in the week. There really aren't. I mean, most MPs will work from Monday through to Saturday. And my view is you should try and have one day off work. Now, some Sundays are busy, but in terms of appointing people, the critical thing is having somebody who can be your key point of access, so that they manage the incoming emails and texts and tweets and phone calls and all the other stuff from the constituency. And you also need somebody who can help work through the cases which people bring to you, which are often quite complex, and they might be healthcare or housing or whatever it is. So those are the two critical bits. And now these days, because of the plethora of social media outlets, you also need somebody, I think, who is able to help you use those channels in a concerted way, so that you're listening, you're hearing what's going on, but you're also able to put back out what you're doing. And that's in addition to being, I don't think there's any substitute for being there in person. You can do all the social media you like, but there's no substitute for people saying, "Oh, Mark Prisk was around and Mark Prisk was down at the community hall, and Mark over doing such and such." That's really quite important. So finding the ways to do that is important. Social media is great, but that should be principally about enhancing what you're doing. But I appreciate I'm an older generation, and the way social media operates now is different than when I was in Parliament 6 years ago.
Well, I've started to see with Josh that his social media in terms of video has become a lot more frequent. Would you ever run again, or is your time in politics finished?
No, I've had my time. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it. There were good days and bad days, as there are in any job. But no, I've had my time. It's time for a new generation.
And my last question for you, Mark, would be: was being an MP fun?
Yes, it was. There were great things. You get the opportunity to do things I would never have done, in terms of foreign travel, in terms of getting to know different parts of a community, being able to make a difference to individual community lives, the privilege of standing and speaking in the House of Commons, or of meeting, the King or Queen, all those sorts of things. They are a tremendous privilege. So I'm very pleased I did it. And yeah, it was good fun.
Well, Mark, I have left this being very, very inspired. I really appreciate you joining me. There's so much more we could have spoken about, but I really appreciate you spending your time with me.
No problems. Thank you, Jamie, and all the best.
Thank you very much.